Mount Hermon rises 9,132 feet above sea level, straddling the modern border between Syria and Lebanon. Since 1974, a United Nations buffer zone has restricted civilian access to its upper slopes. The summit itself is effectively sealed off. First, Enoch names this exact peak, not a general region, not a mountain range, but this specific summit as the precise site of a descent. The oath sworn there survives in Aramaic fragments. Qumran fragment 4Q201 still preserves names that were later banned, buried, and declared non-canonical. One text, one decision, and for roughly 15 centuries, that decision held. Then in 1947, a Bedouin shepherd tossed a stone into a cave above the Dead Sea and heard something shatter. What came out of that cave changed everything. Among the scrolls recovered at Qumran were fragments of 1st Enoch, fragments predating the New Testament by at least 2 centuries, not copies of some fringe document, source material, and here's what makes it impossible to simply wave away. Jude 1:14, sitting comfortably inside the accepted biblical canon, quotes Enoch directly, word for word. The book that got banned is cited by the book that got kept. The very institution that removed one text preserved the other, and the surviving one contains the quote. What 1st Enoch actually describes isn't a single vague adversary acting alone. It records a hierarchy, named individuals, ranked positions, specific locations, specific acts. The text reads less like mythology and more like a deposition, a formal record of who came, what they did, and what followed. Over the next stretch, we'll walk through what the original Aramaic names and ranks actually say, what modern scholarship has confirmed about the manuscript trail, and why the structure Enoch recorded got systematically flattened into something far simpler. The passage in question comes from 1st Enoch, chapter 6, verses 1 through 7. The primary Aramaic manuscript is catalogued as 4Q1, housed at the Shrine of the Book at the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. The standard English translation is still the one produced by R.H. Charles at Oxford in 1912, still cited, still referenced, still the baseline for nearly every serious comparative study since. The text doesn't open with a single figure, it opens with a number, 200. 200 beings descended, not one, not a handful, but 200, organized, named, and sworn to a collective oath before they made their move. The Aramaic term used for them is plural, yair, or watchers. It isn't a poetic stand-in for angel in the general sense. It's a technical designation, a distinct rank operating separately from the messenger class that most later translations collapse everything into. Leading them was Samyaza, a name that carries weight precisely because of where it doesn't appear. Search the earlier Hebrew texts. Search the Mesopotamian records that predate Enoch by 1,000 years. Samyaza isn't there. He has no theological predecessor, no earlier tradition naming him or granting him authority over others. 1st Enoch names him first. That's not a borrowed figure, that's an origin point. The oath Samyaza administered was sworn at the summit of Mount Hermon, the same sealed peak, the same restricted coordinates mentioned earlier, and the oath served a specific function. It bound all 200 to the decision collectively, so no single watcher could later claim he'd acted alone or under coercion. The text records the structure of accountability before it records the act itself. That's not the architecture of myth, that's the architecture of a legal document. R.H. Charles, working from the Ethiopic manuscripts alongside the Aramaic fragments, published 22 names in his 1912 Oxford edition, 22 individual watchers, each named, each assigned a specific domain of forbidden knowledge they would go on to transmit. The tradition that removed this text later replaced those 22 named figures and the 200 they commanded with a single unnamed adversary. One devil. No rank, no structure, no names. Once you see the substitution, it's hard to unsee. Here's the knowledge problem the text creates. The author of 1st Enoch writing no later than the 2nd century, before the Common Era, quite possibly earlier, describes a coordinated descent, a sworn hierarchy, a named leadership structure, and the transmission of specific knowledge to human recipients. He doesn't frame this as a symbolic vision. He frames it as a sequence of events with identifiable participants. That precision is exactly the problem. Visions don't usually come with 22 names and a roll call. Modern scholars working the manuscript evidence, Charles in 1912, researchers cataloguing the Qumran fragments in the 1990s, arrive at the same conclusion through very different routes. The text is old, the names hold consistent across manuscript traditions separated by geography and centuries. Where the church later simplified everything down to one devil, Enoch recorded 200 ranked individuals under a named commander, bound by a sworn oath, tied to a specific mountain, and what those 200 brought down with them goes far deeper than the descent itself. Now to the figure the text holds most responsible, not Samyaza, not the 200 as a collective. One name carries the weight of the verdict, Azazel. 1 Enoch chapter 8 verses 8 through 10, preserved in manuscript MS Kebron 9, housed at Kebron Gabriel Monastery on Lake Tana in Ethiopia, translated by Dr. Michael Knibb in his 1978 Oxford Critical Edition. The passage reads precisely, more like a criminal indictment than a myth. Azazel taught men to make swords, knives, shields, and breastplates. He revealed to them the metals of the earth and the craft of working them. He showed women how to use antimony as coloring, how to darken and beautify the eyes, and taught them about precious stones and dyes. And godlessness spread. People were led astray, corrupted in their ways. That's a list, a specific itemized list. The term scholars typically translate as sorcery is, in its more literal construction, closer to hidden cutting knowledge. Knowledge that cuts, knowledge that was concealed rather than freely given, extracted and deliberately handed to people who were never meant to have it. Now weigh that against the archaeological record. Bronze Age metallurgy, the smelting of copper alloys, the forging of bladed weapons, shows up in the Near East around 3300 BCE. Before that, the record is stone tools. Then, within a surprisingly narrow archaeological window, copper arsenical blades, tin bronze swords, and iron-tipped spears all appear. In some sites, the transition isn't gradual at all. It's abrupt. The Enoch text, copied from manuscript scholars, date to the 3rd century BCE at the latest, describes weapons technology, cosmetic chemistry, and what it calls the secrets of the angels in exactly the order material culture archaeology later confirmed. Bladed weapons first, decorative metals second, ritual arts third. There was no way to construct that sequence purely from observation at the time it was written. The text predates the archaeology that would confirm it by more than 2,000 years. And yet the sequence holds. The cosmetics detail isn't incidental either. Antimony-based coal, used to darken the eyelids, shows up in Egyptian burial sites as early as 3100 BCE. The Enoch text names it specifically, not as a vague category of vanity, but by its function, its application, its cultural context. That's not poetry, that's documentation, but the verdict is what seals this section. In chapter 10 of the same manuscript, God speaks directly, and the sentence reads, "Ascribe all sin to Azazel, not some of the sin, not the sins of the watchers collectively, all of it." The entire corruption of the pre-flood world gets laid on a single name. And here's where the Hebrew Bible intersects in a way that's hard to write off as coincidence. Leviticus 16, the Day of Atonement ritual. 2 goats, one for God, one for Azazel. Most English Bibles don't even translate the word. It sits there in the original Hebrew, Elei Azazel, untouched and unexplained, sent out into the wilderness, carrying the sins of the nation. That ritual isn't metaphor. The name Azazel is written directly into the oldest layer of Israelite ritual law, same name, Same function, the one who bears the sin, the one who is sent away. Not a concept, a named figure embedded in the law of Moses, whose backstory Leviticus never explains, but Enoch does. The church separated the two texts, Enoch removed, Leviticus kept, and the name stayed stripped of context. A word with no reference, a ritual with no backstory. The backstory sits in Enoch. Azazel isn't the end of the hierarchy, though. What his corruption produced, what walked the earth after the Watchers descended, carries a consequence the church has never fully explained. For centuries, church teaching has treated demons as simply fallen angels under a different label. The creeds never pin it down. The councils never formally settled it. Most believers just absorb the assumption. Enoch disagrees, by name, with a structural argument that's hard to misread. First, Enoch chapter 15, verses 8 through 12, preserved in manuscript MS Kebron 9 at Lake Tana, Ethiopia, translated by Dr. Michael Knibb, Oxford, 1978. The passage is addressed directly to Enoch by the divine voice and reads like a legal ruling, a formal decree of classification. The giants, the Nephilim, were born of spirit and flesh together, their origin mixed from the start. They would be called evil spirits on the earth, proceeding from bodies born of both men and the holy watchers, their beginning rooted in beings below, even though their fathers came from above. That's a taxonomy, a formal classification of origin. The Ge'ez term used is typically translated evil spirits, but its literal construction is closer to those born of flesh and heaven, not purely spiritual, not purely physical, a hybrid category with no home in heaven and no rest on earth. The Watchers, the 200, are imprisoned. They have a location, a judgment, a sentence. They are not the demons wandering the earth. Enoch is explicit about that. The Watchers are bound. Their children, the Nephilim, died in the flood, but the spirits of those children had nowhere to go. Not angels, so they couldn't return to heaven, not fully human, so they couldn't rest in the earth. The flood destroyed their bodies. Their spirits remained. And the text records exactly what those spirits do. They oppress, they mislead, they attack, they cause hunger and thirst, they bring disease, they strike without visible cause. Enoch lists these functions with the same precision he uses everywhere else, not as metaphor, but as a description of ongoing activity. This is where the knowledge problem sharpens again. The ancient world had no germ theory, no neurology, no framework for psychiatry. Yet Enoch records a category of disembodied entities causing physical illness, mental disturbance, and social breakdown, and assigns them an origin that explains why they behave differently from every other spiritual category in the text. Hybrid, homeless, hungry. That framework lines up almost exactly with what demonology across unrelated cultures independently describes: entities that are not gods, not ghosts, not angels, but something in between. The Mesopotamian Udug, the Greek daimones, the Hebrew shedim, different names, the same behavioral profile, spanning civilizations with no documented contact with each other. Enoch names the origin. Every other tradition just describes the symptoms. The church inherited the symptom literature: exorcism, oppression, spiritual warfare, without the origin text, because the origin text had already been removed. So the question every serious theologian eventually runs into, where do demons actually come from, goes unanswered in the canon. Enoch answers it in a single passage: born of the Nephilim, left homeless after the flood, still walking. But here's what makes this stranger than anything the church actually teaches. The flood itself, the event that destroyed the Nephilim's bodies and set their spirits loose, wasn't primarily framed as a moral judgment. Enoch records it as something far more specific, a targeted response to a crisis that had already crossed a point of no return. The version most people know treats the flood as a story about human wickedness, moral failure so total that God reset the world. Essentially, the Genesis account, a handful of verses on cause followed mostly by cubits and animals. Enoch gives the full cause, and it isn't quite what gets taught. First Enoch chapter 10 verses 4 through 12. Dead Sea Fragment 4Q204, column 6, recovered from Qumran Cave 4 in 1952, now held at the Israel Antiquities Authority in Jerusalem, cross-referenced against the Ge'ez manuscripts by Dr. George Nickelsburg in his 2001 Hermeneia Critical Commentary. The fragment preserves the imprisonment decree nearly word for word, a direct divine command. Bind Azazel hand and foot, cast him into the darkness, make an opening in the desert at Dudael, and throw him there. Cover him with rough, jagged rocks and darkness, and let him remain there permanently, his face covered so he cannot see light. On the day of judgment, he will be cast into the fire. That's not metaphor, that's a location order, naming Dudael as a specific desert site, jagged rocks, darkness, a confinement with a specific future sentence attached. The term used for the place of confinement is usually translated abyss, though its literal root means closer to the deep place with no end. Not a symbol of evil, but a physical location described with the same geographic specificity Enoch uses for Mount Hermon. 200 watchers, bound and imprisoned in fiery chasms until final judgment. Then the text records something that stops the reading cold. Their spirits still walk free. The watchers themselves are bound, but what they produced, the Nephilim, and what the Nephilim left behind, the disembodied spirits, were never imprisoned alongside them. That was deliberate. The text frames it as design. The watchers are contained. Their legacy is not. And then the flood. In the same passage, God instructs Noah that the earth will be cleansed and the giants destroyed. But the stated reason isn't human sin alone. The text is fairly direct. The earth had been corrupted at a genetic, spiritual, and structural level. The watchers had altered something at the root. The Nephilim had spread across the earth, bloodlines compromised, and the knowledge Azazel handed down had effectively weaponized human civilization against itself. The flood, in this framing, wasn't a moral lesson. It was closer to a containment operation. Dead Sea Fragment 4Q204 preserves this decree in Aramaic, copied no later than the 1st century BCE, meaning the imprisonment order and the flood's rationale existed in written form at least a century before the Common Era. The Ge'ez manuscripts confirm the same material independently through a tradition with no documented contact with Qumran, 2 separate manuscript lineages, 2 separate languages, the same decree, the same named location, the same stated cause for the flood. Most modern teaching frames the flood as a story about obedience and grace. Enoch records it closer to a war against a hybrid species that had corrupted the biological and spiritual architecture of the world, fought by divine command, executed through water, and followed by the imprisonment of those responsible. The watchers are bound, the Nephilim are destroyed, the spirits of the Nephilim still walk, and the structure that commanded all of it, the hierarchy above Samyaza, above Azazel, above the 200, doesn't end there, because the text points to a head of that hierarchy who isn't the figure later tradition would call Satan. What Enoch records about that figure reframes the entire picture most people were taught. The Ethiopic manuscripts of First Enoch still sit in monastery collections today, unredacted. The Qumran fragments, 4Q201 through 4Q204, are publicly catalogued at the Shrine of the Book in Jerusalem. Anyone can verify that Jude 1 quotes a text the Church officially classifies as non-canonical. The hierarchy Enoch recorded, watchers, Nephilim spirits, named commanders, stays intact across every surviving copy. The suppression is checkable. The text predates the institution that banned it, and the structure it describes, the chain of command, the named figures at the top of it, is still exactly as recorded.